The fog over the Vistula that January morning was so thick, it seemed as if one could cut it with a knife. The silence hanging over the frozen river was deceiving. It was not calm, but the extreme tension of a gigantic spring, ready to uncoil with a force that the history of wars had not yet seen. On the western bank, in their dugouts, German generals peered into the milky whiteness, trying to guess when the inevitable would begin. They knew the Russians were here. They knew there were many of them. But even the most pessimistic intelligence reports could not convey the true scale of the catastrophe that was approaching the Third Reich from the east. On January 12, 1945, at precisely 5 o'clock in the morning Moscow time, silence ceased to exist. The sky ripped open with thousands of flashes, and the earth trembled as if a tectonic plate shift had begun. This was not just an offensive. It was the finale of a great drama, an act of retribution, and the triumph of a war machine that, in 4 years, had gone from the chaos of retreat to a perfect mechanism for destroying resistance. The Vistula-Oder offensive is often perceived as an easy stroll, a swift march to the beast's lair. But behind this speed lay a complex chess game played on fields soaked with iron and blood. To understand the phenomenon of this breakthrough, one must rewind time a little, to the autumn of '44. After the grand success of Operation Bagration, Soviet troops halted at the Vistula line. The front line froze. In Allied headquarters, whispers began. Why are the Russians standing still? Have they run out of steam? Or even worse, are they deliberately allowing the Germans to suppress the uprising in Warsaw? Suspicions grew, but the reality was far more prosaic and harsh. The rear had fallen hundreds of kilometers behind. Tanks needed repairs. People needed rest. And most importantly, it was necessary to accumulate such reserves that would allow not just to break through the defenses, but to raze them to the ground and reach Berlin in one breath. This was a pause not for sleep, but for preparing a blow of monstrous power. The headquarters of the Supreme High Command planned the operation with mathematical precision. Soviet engineers performed the impossible. They built bridges underwater to hide crossings from German aircraft. During the day, life on the bridgeheads ceased, creating the illusion of weak activity. But at night, everything came to life. Thousands of trucks, hundreds of ammunition trains, endless columns of infantry converged on the front line. This was the greatest mystification, or, as Soviet strategists called it, camouflage. The Germans were led to believe that the main blow would be struck somewhere else entirely, or that the offensive would begin much later. General Guderian, chief of the German General Staff, tried to convince Hitler of the danger, reporting colossal accumulations of Soviet tanks. But the Führer, already living in a world of his illusions, called these reports the greatest bluff since Genghis Khan. This delusion proved fatal for the Wehrmacht. When the artillery storm began on January 12th, the German defenses, which they had been fortifying for months, simply evaporated. The density of fire reached 250 guns per kilometer of front. This meant that for every 4 meters of enemy trench, there was one heavy barrel. Shells plowed the earth, destroying minefields, wire entanglements, pillboxes, and manpower. The first line of defense ceased to exist within hours. Soviet troops, led by Marshals Zhukov and Konev, surged forward not on foot, but on the armor of tanks. A new tactical maneuver was employed. Tanks with headlights on and sirens wailing attacked in the pre-dawn twilight, psychologically suppressing the remnants of enemy will. The howl, the clatter of tracks, and the searchlight beams created an effect of apocalypse. However, beneath the outward brilliance of the rapid breakthrough lay immense internal work and colossal tension. The First Belarusian and First Ukrainian fronts acted like two gigantic hammers. But between their commanders, Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev, there existed an unspoken and at times quite obvious rivalry. Each of them wanted to be the first to step onto German soil, to cross the Oder, to ultimately take Berlin. Stalin skillfully fueled this competition, understanding that the Marshal's ambitions accelerated the troops' advance. But this race also had a downside. The desire to surge ahead forced commanders to take risks, stretch their flanks, and outrun their supply bases. Tank armies would break through 50, 70 kilometers a day. The infantry couldn't keep up. Artillery lagged behind. Tankers found themselves deep in enemy territory, often without support, relying only on their armor, speed, and audacity. The external conflict unfolded not only on staff maps, but also in the mind of every soldier. The Soviet soldier of 1945 was no longer the bewildered recruit of 1941. This was an experienced, battle-hardened professional who had seen the ruined cities of his homeland, lost loved ones, and passed through the hell of Stalingrad and Kursk. A complex feeling drove them, a mixture of furious thirst for justice and incredible weariness. They were entering enemy territory. For the first time in the entire war, they saw neat German houses, paved roads, and rich estates. This contrast between a ruined, burned Russia and a prosperous Germany evoked a storm of emotions. The question of revenge hung in the air. Political officers held discussions, urging them not to emulate the fascists, to maintain human dignity. But it was incredibly difficult to hold back the avalanche of anger. Every step on German soil was a test of humanity. Meanwhile, the German army was in agony. Army Group A, opposing the Soviet offensive, was not just defeated, it was torn apart. Communication between headquarters and divisions broke down in the very first days. German generals lost control of their troops. Orders didn't arrive, or were outdated even before they were given. Huge masses of German soldiers mixed with refugees retreated westward, creating chaos on the roads. Panic gripped not only the army, but also the civilian population. German propaganda had for years depicted Soviet soldiers as monsters, knowing no mercy. And now, as the front collapsed, millions of people fled, abandoning homes and possessions. The winter of '45 was harsh. Frosts, snowdrifts, endless lines of carts and people freezing on the roadsides. This was a picture of a biblical exodus and the catastrophe of an entire nation. The speed of the Soviet offensive created unique tactical situations. Tank wedges bypassed large fortress cities, leaving them in the rear for subsequent infantry mopping up operations. Poznan, Breslau, Schneidemühl. These cities were declared Festungs by Hitler, fortresses that were to fight to the last man. The garrisons in them fought with the desperation of the doomed, tying up significant Red Army forces. But Zhukov and Konev did not stop. The main goal was the Oder, the last major water barrier before Berlin. Soviet tankers broke into operational space, capturing airfields with planes ready for takeoff, railway stations with echelons of equipment. There were cases when Soviet tanks drove into cities where cinemas were still operating and trams were running, and local residents mistook them for new models of German equipment until they saw the red stars on the turrets. But in this symphony of victory, alarming notes began to sound. Supply became a critical problem. Railways in the liberated territories had a different gauge. They had to be re-gauged, which took time. Road transport could not cope with the supply line, which stretched for 500 kilometers. Fuel for tanks was delivered by planes, but it was not enough. Ammunition at the front was dwindling. Engines wore out, people hadn't slept for weeks. At this moment, a deep ideological conflict of the entire operation became apparent. What was more important, the symbolism of an instantaneous capture of Berlin or military expediency and the preservation of lives? Some historians argue that Berlin could have been taken on the fly as early as February 45th. The Germans had not managed to organize their defenses on the Oder. The path to the capital of the Reich seemed open. The temptation to end the war with one blow was colossal. But the risk was no less. The flanks of the Soviet wedges were exposed. In Pomerania, to the north, a large group of German troops under Himmler's command was looming. A strike from there could cut off Zhukov's advanced units, turning triumph into a catastrophe, similar to what happened near Warsaw in the 20th year. Heated debates began at headquarters. Chuikov, the hero of Stalingrad, was eager to push forward, claiming that the Germans were demoralized and would not be able to counterattack. Zhukov, more cautious and pragmatic, pointed out the danger. Stalin, weighing all the arguments, made a decision that still causes controversy: to stop. The main forces were deployed north to Pomerania and south to Silesia to eliminate flank threats. The offensive on Berlin was postponed. This turn became a transformative moment of the entire winter campaign. From a reckless dash, the operation turned into a methodical grinding down of the remnants of the Wehrmacht. The Soviet blitzkrieg was replaced by a strategy of guaranteed destruction. This decision, perhaps, extended the war by a couple of months, but it also secured the final blow. The Soviet command showed that it had learned the lessons of 41. No adventures, only cold calculation. But this calculation had a price. The battles in Pomerania and East Prussia proved to be bloody. The Germans fought for every meter of their land with the fury of a cornered beast. The culmination of the Vistula-Oder operation came in late January, early February, when advanced detachments reached the Oder. The capture of bridgeheads on the western bank of the river became a feat bordering on madness. The ice was thin, shattered by artillery. Soldiers crossed in boats, on rafts, over fragments of bridges under heavy fire. Holding these scraps of land, bridgeheads in the areas of Kustrin and Frankfurt, was a matter of life and death. From here, 2 months later, the final assault on Berlin would begin. These battles, in their intensity, were not inferior to the hottest battles of the war. The Germans threw their last reserves into counterattacks, including cadets from military schools and battalions of the Volkssturm. But they failed to throw the Soviet troops into the river. The wedge was driven in. Only 60 or 70 kilometers remained to Hitler's bunker. Now, looking back, we must ask about the price. Official Soviet historiography liked to cite casualty figures that seemed surprisingly low for an operation of this scale. It spoke of skill, of preserving people. But modern studies, based on declassified archives, paint a more complex picture. Yes, the irrevocable losses of the Red Army in the Vistula-Oder operation were significantly lower than those of the Wehrmacht. The ratio reached 1 to 5 or even more in favor of the attackers, which in itself is unique in military history. Usually the attacker loses more. But in absolute terms, these were tens of thousands of lives. Thousands of tanks burned in the fields of Poland and Germany. Losses were especially high in those very cauldrons, where blocked garrisons of German fortresses resisted for weeks. The myth of the bloodless walk is dangerous because it devalues heroism. When we say that everything went smoothly, we forget about the sappers who cleared passages under fire, about the drivers who didn't sleep for days delivering ammunition, about the medics in field hospitals collapsing from exhaustion. The success of the operation was secured not only by the genius of commanders, but also by the extreme exertion of millions of people. Supply problems were real and acute. Tanks often stalled without fuel in the middle of the field, becoming easy targets. Artillery didn't always manage to support the infantry. And then, rifle companies had to storm fortifications with only rifles and grenades. This was not an ideal war from a textbook, but hard, dirty, terrible work, performed with incredible perseverance. Another important aspect of the resonance is liberation. The Vistula-Oder operation brought freedom to the western part of Poland. It was during this offensive that prisoners from many concentration camps, including Auschwitz, were liberated. What Soviet soldiers saw there forever changed their perception of the enemy. It was a shock impossible to convey in words. Mountains of shoes, clothes, crematoria ovens, people emaciated to skeletons. This experience became a powerful moral factor. Now the soldiers knew exactly what absolute evil they were fighting. This gave them strength, but also hardened their hearts. The question of how to remain human when seeing such things became the main ethical challenge for the victors. The significance of the Vistula-Oder operation extends far beyond military strategy. It demonstrated to the whole world that the Red Army had reached the peak of its power. This was a signal to the Allies. The Soviet Union was capable of ending the war on its own if necessary. This changed the political alignment for the upcoming Yalta Conference. Stalin received a trump card. His tanks were an hour's drive from Berlin. The borders of post-war Europe began to be drawn by the tracks of T-34s precisely in those January days. The lesson we can learn today lies in understanding the nature of effectiveness. A brilliant result on the map is often achieved through hidden, unseen efforts and sacrifices. We see arrows pointing west, but we don't see broken destinies and the titanic labor of rear services. The Vistula-Oder operation is an example of how careful planning, multiplied by the courage of the executors, can break even the strongest defense. But it is also a reminder that any speed has its price. Halting the offensive to secure the flanks teaches us the importance of strategic patience. The ability to stop a step away from the goal to prepare and deliver a sure blow is perhaps a higher manifestation of military art than a thoughtless rush forward. In conclusion, we return to the image of the river. The Vistula was left behind. Now before the soldiers was the Oder. The same fogs, the same cold water, the same expectations. The cycle closed, but on a new level. The army that stood on the Vistula was full of hopes and anxieties. The army that reached the Oder was confident in its invincibility. The path from one river to another became a path of transformation for millions of people. They stepped over fear, over pain, over the impossible. And although statistics would later be smoothed over and losses averaged in reports, the true truth about those days will remain in the memory of the earth, which shuddered from the tread of the liberators. January of '45 will forever remain the month when time compressed and history rushed forward, sweeping away the 1,000-year Reich that seemed eternal. The complexity of evaluating this operation lies in the duality of perception. On the one hand, it is a masterpiece of operational art. The rates of advance, from 20 to 30 kilometers per day for combined arms armies and up to 70 for tank armies, remain unsurpassed in the history of wars of such a scale. Neither before nor after has any army in the world overcome such saturated defenses at such speed on a front 500 kilometers wide. This was a triumph of the Soviet deep operation doctrine. The theory, developed back in the 1930s, finally found its ideal embodiment. The interaction of different branches of arms, aviation, artillery, tanks, and infantry, reached the level of a symphony orchestra, where each instrument enters at the right moment. On the other hand, we encounter the dark matter of war, the chaos that inevitably accompanies such large-scale movements. Rear echelons lagged so far behind that tankers had to refuel with captured gasoline and use German food depots. There were cases when entire corps found themselves cut off from their own, fighting in complete encirclement deep within enemy territory until the main forces caught up with them. This demanded the highest initiative and independence from commanders at all levels, from lieutenant to general. The Soviet Army, often accused of rigidity and a strict vertical chain of command, demonstrated miracles of improvisation during these days. Junior officers made decisions that determined the fate of divisions, and these decisions often proved correct. Special attention should be paid to logistics, which became the true unsung hero of the operation. Railway troops performed a feat comparable to a combat one, restoring a bridge across the Vistula in a few days, under bombing in icy water. This is a task beyond human capabilities, but they did it. They re-gauged tracks at a speed of up to 15 kilometers per day. Without this steel flow of supplies, the offensive would have choked within a week. Shells, cartridges, canned goods, bandages, millions of tons of cargo had to flow continuously westward, following the advancing front. And when this flow thinned, the offensive slowed down, proving the old truth. Amateurs discuss tactics, professionals discuss logistics. One cannot forget about the air. Soviet aviation dominated the skies, but the weather in January 1945 often played into the hands of the defenders. Low clouds, snowfalls, fogs kept attack aircraft grounded. On such days, the entire burden of support fell on the artillery. It was the artillerymen who gnawed a path for the tanks. The rolling barrage, a method of accompanying infantry with fire where a wall of explosions rolls ahead of the attackers, sweeping away everything living, was perfected to an art. German soldiers in their memoirs recalled this fiery roller with horror. They wrote that Russian artillery not only suppressed, it changed the landscape, turning forests into splinters and villages into a lunar landscape. The psychological aspect of the confrontation between the two systems is also interesting. German discipline, considered the standard for centuries, began to show cracks. Mass surrender, desertion, and failure to obey orders became commonplace for the Wehrmacht. The system, built on fear and blind obedience, crumbled under the blows of a force it considered inferior. The Soviet soldier, whom Nazi ideology called an Untermensch, proved his complete superiority on the battlefield, not only in numbers, but also in skill, ingenuity, and spirit. This was a clash not just of armies, but of worldviews. The idea of racial superiority shattered against the armor of Soviet tanks. In historical discussions, the question of Warsaw often arises. The liberation of the Polish capital on January 17th became an important milestone in the operation. The city lay in ruins, destroyed by the Germans after the uprising. Soviet troops entered a dead city. This site also became a powerful catalyst for emotions. The view of shattered beauty, the skeletons of buildings, empty streets, all of this evoked a feeling of deep sorrow and fury. The political significance of taking Warsaw was enormous. It legitimized the pro-Soviet government of Poland and solidified the USSR's influence in the region. But for the common soldier, it was another step towards the end of the war, another frontier that needed to be overcome to return home. In the context of losses and statistics, it is important to note how the counting methodology changed. At the beginning of the war, accounting was chaotic. Documents were often lost along with headquarters. By 45, the bureaucratic machine of the Red Army was working smoothly. However, there was a practice of smoothing out unpleasant figures. Losses could be distributed across different categories. The wounded, those who died in hospitals, might not appear in summary reports of combat losses for a specific operation. Nevertheless, even considering possible inaccuracies, the ratio of losses in the Vistula-Oder operation is phenomenal. This is explained by the fact that the Wehrmacht was deprived of the opportunity to retreat in an organized manner and occupy new lines. The speed of the Soviet offensive did not allow the Germans to consolidate. They were forced to fight in the open field, on the march, surrounded, where their advantages in tactical defense were reduced to zero. A modern view of these events requires us to abandon a black and white picture of the world. The Vistula-Oder operation was not a sterile victory of robots. It was a drama of living people. Mistakes were made, and they were paid for with blood. Friendly fire, confusion in the interaction of units, unjustified frontal attacks on fortified points, all of this happened. But the greatness of the event lies not in the absence of mistakes, but in the ability to overcome their consequences and achieve the goal. The stature of Zhukov, Konev, Rokossovsky was manifested precisely in their ability to manage this gigantic chaos, directing the energy of millions of people into a single channel. Their harshness, sometimes cruelty, was dictated by the logic of total war, where pity for their own soldiers sometimes turned into defeat and even greater casualties. Approaching the end of our narrative, we see how all threads converge at one point, on the Oder bridgeheads. Here, at the end of February, a temporary lull set in. But this was already a different silence, not the one that hung over the Vistula in January. It was the silence before the final push. The air smelled of spring and victory. Soldiers wrote letters home, already with addresses, Field Post, Germany. In these letters, there was less pathos, but more hope. They understood that the worst was behind them, but the hardest part, the last step, was still ahead. The Vistula-Oder operation will remain in history as an example of how the impossible becomes possible when there is will, resources, and skill. It teaches us that even the most powerful enemy, has its vulnerabilities, and that speed and onslaught can be the best defense. But it also serves as an eternal reminder of the tragedy of war. Behind every arrow on the map, behind every number in a report, lies a human life, a unique universe that ended so that these arrows could move west. And remembering the brilliant maneuvers of tank armies, we must also remember the nameless infantryman who lay in the snow somewhere near Poznan, not reaching victory by just a couple of months. His silent sacrifice is the foundation upon which the edifice of great triumph stands. The legacy of this battle lives on today. The principles of the massive use of armored forces, deep penetration, and operational camouflage are studied in military academies around the world. Modern strategists analyze the experience of the Vistula-Oder operation, trying to understand how to apply its lessons in the conditions of 21st century wars. Technologies have changed. High-precision weapons and drones have appeared, but the laws of war, the laws of psychology, logistics, and maneuver have remained the same. And in this sense, the events of January 45 remain a relevant textbook, written not in ink, but in action. When the smoke of history dissipates, facts and memory remain. Facts tell us about the defeat of 35 German divisions, about an advance of 500 kilometers, about the liberation of a significant part of Poland. Memory tells us about the cold, about fear, about the joy of liberated prisoners, about the bitterness of losses. Combining these two layers, cold analytics and living emotion, we get a complete picture of the Vistula-Oder operation. Not a myth, not a Lubbock, but a grandiose, complex, contradictory, and great event that heralded the end of the most terrible catastrophe in human history. And when we look at the map of Europe today, we must remember that its contours were largely determined by that swift dash from the Vistula to the Oder, a dash that changed the world.